Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. The forest opened up to reveal small clearings that contained oats, barley, and the occasional cluster of rye. Kell caught glimpses of farmhouses hidden among the trees further back away from the road. They rode past the narrow turnoffs that led to the houses and continued down the path. Jupe and Kell intermittently engaged in small talk, but for the most part they rode on in silence, enjoying the autumn air. At one point along the road, Kell looked over at Jupe and asked, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" Jupe smiled and nodded. Kell cleared his throat and began. "Back at the mill, before George tried to kill me, something happened." Jupe grunted. "Indeed, something did happen. You used magic. That's what happened. And quite by accident, it seemed." Kell stared at him in astonishment, but when it was clear he wasn't going to say anything, Jupe continued. "Don't you worry, though. I'm not scared of you. And you're not a witch, either, so you can get that out of your head." Kell's head was still spinning. "I don't remember ever using magic before. I don't even know how. Believe me, I'm no mage." Jupe barked a laugh. "I suppose you wouldn't. How could you remember something as complicated and intricate as magic and the disciplines of the Magi when you can't even remember your own name?" Kell froze, all thought of magic suddenly gone from his mind. "What are you talking about?" he began carefully, attempting to act confused. "My name is Kell." Jupe turned in his seat and looked Kell straight in the eye. His gaze was penetrating. It seemed to look straight through him. "We are both grown men," he stated flatly. "Do me the courtesy of not playing childish games with me." Kell closed his mouth and swallowed, not sure how to proceed. Jupe held his gaze for a moment longer before looking forward and continuing. "I'm not angry. It's not your fault you can't remember." Kell took a deep breath and resigned himself to his situation. He supposed that Jupe may have found out sooner or later if he stayed at his farm. He just hadn't expected it to be sooner. "How did you know?" asked Kell. "When you first introduced yourself to me at the mill, I could see it in your eyes that you weren't telling me the truth. It wasn't malicious, you simply didn't know your name." He called to Bear, encouraging him to pick up the speed. "The more we talked, the more I knew you didn't know who you were. I assumed that you were a soldier. There are several cases that I can think of where a soldier will go through a traumatic experience or be hit by some unfortunate bit of magic on the battlefield and lose all his memory of himself. When you used magic on Theod earlier, it confirmed it." Kell's attention perked up. "Why did it confirm it for you?" He was finally getting answers to who he was, and his excitement was growing. "Nothing unique about it," said Jupe matter-of-factly. "No spark of artistry that you might expect from an accomplished spellcaster. Quite the opposite, really. I'm fairly certain what you used was flash casting. It's a common enough form of lay magic that almost anyone can master. All it takes is a bit of study and a functioning memory. It isn't unheard of for soldiers to memorize a bit of lay magic and use it in battle. It helps improve their chances of survival." Kell blinked, digesting what he had heard. "So what you're saying is that I'm not much nearer to remembering who I am." He sighed and put his head in his hands, resting his elbows on his knees. The cart bumped along the road. "Not exactly," said Jupe, pointing with his finger in the air. "Flash casting is based on the caster's ability to remember images of drawn spell forms. They channel their magic through the image in their memory, and a spell form activates. This can be done incredibly quick, without the caster actually understanding or comprehending the meaning of the spell. The magic interprets the image and accomplishes its intended goal. It's the perfect bit of lay magic for an uneducated soldier to handle. No offense, of course. Now, because the caster has to be able to perfectly remember an image of a drawn spell for the magic to work, any loss of memory would result in the inability to perform any sort of flash casting." Jupe raised his hand and looked over at Kell, making sure that he understood his point. "The fact that you can use flash casting in an accurate, non-destructive way indicates that your memories are simply buried deep in your mind. They are not totally lost." Kell's mind was racing. If his memories were just buried and not lost, then retrieving them could actually be achievable, not some fantasy. And then he remembered. Back at the mill, when Theod spoke to me, I had flashes of memory. They were extremely painful. If regaining my lost memory requires me to go through something like that again, on a larger scale, I'm not sure I can handle it. Just a small amount almost made me black out. Jupe grunted. Don't worry. What Theod did, paused and clenched his fists around the reins. What Theod did was intended to cause you pain. Again, I'm awfully sorry about that whole incident. Kel looked up at the colored leaves as the cart passed through a grove of birch trees. Was Theod using flash casting? He asked. No, Jupe grunted, smirking to himself. Theod lacks the patience to actually sit down and memorize details of an intricately drawn spell form. He is one of two, well, three if you count yourself, people in Rockford who have demonstrated any magical ability, as far as I have discovered at least. However, Theod is a brute. There is none of the finesse and delicacy in him that good lay magic requires. A long time ago, before he and I were at odds with each other, we were actually good friends. We discovered our magic at roughly the same time. When we were younger, I got my hands on a manual, bought it from a trader, all about lay magic and the basics of spellcasting. Jupe grunted a laugh. Theod took one look at the complicated spell forms that made up the basics, and decided lay magic wasn't his calling. Kel frowned. You said that he did something to me. Oh, he did, said Jupe. And it was magic, of a sort. Though Theod never pursued lay magic, he didn't give up on using his newly discovered power. Few people ever do. He found that if he simply channeled his magic, which isn't that hard to do with a bit of practice, things would happen, even without the complicated spell forms of lay magic. If he was angry, his magic would break things. If he felt strongly, others around him would begin to feel the same way. He got quite good at it after a fashion. In essence, he was forcing his emotions onto his surroundings. It's a rudimentary form of lay magic. Theod stumbled on it by accident. If he had taken any time at all to study a bit, he would have learned that all the spell forms and incantations of proper lay magic are all put in place to prevent the very type of magic Theod was performing. It's inefficient, but quite dangerous. Kel nodded in understanding. I see, he said, thinking. So Theod was projecting anger at me using his magic. Is that why it hurt? Because he wanted it to? Jupe bobbed his head. Correct. Theod had a very, negative experience with a young lady who had hair and eyes similar to yours several years ago, although I would say that her hair was closer to white than silver. Your appearance was close enough to hers that it sparked some quite unpleasant memories in Theod's mind. He used those memories to fuel his magic. Hate is the easiest emotion to summon and channel through. It needs no reason, and it can be brought forth at will even by the youngest child. Jupe looked up at the road and worked the reins so that Bear turned to his right, began up a narrow path which led off into the forest. He continued. We're almost at my farm. Let us save the rest of this conversation for when the work is done. He smiled at Kel and turned back to the road. Kel was reluctant to let the issue rest. The topic of magic was captivating his imagination. He could use magic. What happened to me? He wondered. How did I lose my memory? How can I get it back? They rode on in silence until they rounded a bend in the path, and Jupe pointed with his chin. There it is, just up there. A small farmhouse came into view amidst the stand of birch trees, yellow and red with autumn color. Bear pulled the cart around the homestead without Jupe having to guide him. He obviously knew he was home. Behind the house was a small barn with a set of double doors. The cart rolled to a halt just in front of the doors, and Jupe slid down off his seat, stretching his arms over his head, grimacing at the pain in his back. Kel followed and hopped down onto the ground. Moving his legs felt good after the long ride out of town. The sun was sinking low into the trees and shed colored light through the branches. The long shadows that covered the ground pointed to the east toward Rockford, and slowly grew longer, more stretched as they unharnessed Bear from the cart and walked him around for a bit before leading him into his stall. Jupe hung Bear's tack on a hook near his stall and dusted his hands off as he strode back outside. Kel pulled the wagon around the back of the barn and threw a large burlap tarp over it at Jupe's direction. They both tied down its edges around the cart's wheels, making sure it was secure before walking back to the doors of the barn. Bear was happily staring over the fence of his stall at the two of them. Without warning, something hit Kel hard in the back of his knee, almost knocking him over. He glanced down in surprise and saw a small goat looking back up at him and wagging its tail furiously. Kel couldn't help but laugh as he regained his balance and turned to face the animal. Jupe looked over and chuckled. That would be Joan. He squatted down in the dusty grass and stretched out his arms, inviting the little goat over to him. She bleated happily and pranced over into his arms and let him scratch behind her ears. Got her a few years ago from a trader. She's a runt, apparently, so I got her for a good deal. He stood back up, ignoring the protests coming from Joan. There are a lot of things you can do with a goat or two, but I mostly brought her to keep Bear company. Goats are good company to horses. Seeing that she wasn't getting any affection from Jupe, Joan trotted inside the barn and bleated at Bear, who snorted in return. Jupe swung the double doors shut and tied the handles together with a piece of rope. Gesturing for Kel to follow him, he began to walk back around the front of the house. The house was of average size, neither excessively large nor uncomfortably small. The building was in the shape of two large rectangles sitting perpendicular to each other, so that the house looked like one giant elbow. The side of the house closest to them appeared newer in construction, as though it had been added on to the original structure. In the crook of the elbow, there was a porch which led to the door. Windows dotted the paneled walls, and the roof was made of wooden slats that interlocked to prevent water from seeping through them. The stairs onto the porch creaked underfoot as the two of them ascended onto the platform and headed to the door. Jupe produced a ring of keys from his belt, selected one and inserted it into an iron lock on his door. As he turned the key, Jupe explained to Kel, "I didn't used to have a lock. They're quite expensive." He turned the key until it stopped in the lock and tugged on the door to get it open. 2 years ago, I came back home to find my place ransacked. That very day, I went to town and ordered a lock from the smith. I suppose that if a burglar really wanted to get inside, they could break a window or pry the door off its hinges. Having the lock makes me feel safe, though, regardless. He pulled the door wide open and entered the home. "Come on in, then. We'll set you up in the spare room. I built it for hired workers, so it will do nicely for you." Kel smiled to himself. Jupe seemed to be a genuinely good man, and although Kel had no memory of the people he had met in the past, he knew that men such as Jupe were rare to find. He looked around at the forest that surrounded the farmhouse. Even though he couldn't see it, he knew that there was a field of ripened grain nearby that needed to be harvested. The promise of honest work, food, and the possibility of answers to his many questions hanging in the crisp autumn air, Kel's smile deepened. He turned to the door and entered the house. Well, that wraps up this chapter. Stay tuned for the next chapter of the Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand coming soon. In the meantime, you can head over to Amazon and pick up your very own copy. The link is in the description. Leave a comment and a like, make sure to subscribe for more content, and until next time, enjoy the adventure.